Alright, we're going to start our exploration of the Art of Siege Quadra game. This is one of the big soapbox containers. SPI game from right about the same period as Crusades, Armada, a bunch of... this is really kind of at the point where they're experimenting with new systems. And this game is a very strange one. Most Quadra games use a set of rules that kind of work throughout the quad, right? So Great Battles, I'm trying to remember what it is, the Eastern Front battles for World War I, Great Battles of the Eastern Front or something like that. They all have the same rules, kind of like an SCS game has one set of rules. Actually more like the OCS does, in that those rules pretty much stand for the entire series. Some of the others, the 30 Years War Quad that I played recently down here, I have just the Decision Games version. Very much like things like Musket and Pike or something, where there's one solid set of rules and maybe some changes for the scenarios. The quads tended to have more changes for the scenarios than maybe some series games do. But this one, they decided to put a different set of rules, completely different for every game. Tyre shares some aspects with Acre, another game in the series, and some with the companion game, most especially the naval rules, which were left out of it. They came in an S&T, Constantinople. I may or may not have those naval rules. If I do, when I hit Constantinople, hopefully I'll have ships for it. Although I don't know how much they add to the game. Historically, the navies weren't really a major effect. But this one's something different. This is the audacity of Alexander. Who else would siege an island without a navy? But actually, his lack of a navy is why he must take this island. He's attacking the Persians. He's won his big battle. Which one is this? I can never remember my names here. Issus or whatever. The big one in Asia Minor. I can't find it here. I think it's Issus. He's won that already. He's defeated the Persian army. There isn't a major land force to stop him, but there are... Persia's navy is composed of a bunch of basically client states. And Tyre is one of the more impressive of these. So he's got to reduce these cities. And a successful siege of Tyre would pretty much not only ensure that the entire Near Eastern coastline would become Alexander's, but it would also serve as such an example of what his power might be. So he's starting this siege without a navy. And the way he's doing this is building out this little bit of land towards the city. Now that never actually reaches the city during the siege, although eventually he actually changes Tyre from an island because of this mole being built out there. The waves deposited more silt, etc., to being a peninsular city, which is kind of amusing. There aren't a lot of war effects that have drastically changed the geography of an area. All right. So I haven't fully set it up yet, and I'm not sure if I'm going to when I start playing. Basically, these are the Macedonian ground forces, and they're supposed to be set up on the land. They really don't need to be. Tyre's forces, their navies definitely need to be set up, as do any Macedonian navies, well, allied navies that'll come in, and those are over here. The navies have to be set up in the port hexes because, well, naval actions are pretty common in the early part of the game. Eventually, though, it is going to be necessary to set up the ground forces, at least within Tyre, and that's the Tyrian forces here. Let's go over what some of the units have. Let's also look at the victory conditions. The victory conditions essentially are... So this game is really weird, and you'll see I made this little sequence of play sheet. This one my ex-wife inspired me to make these things, but and she made a lot of them, but this one I had to make. That's definitely my handwriting. So there are 3 kinds of turns essentially in a game, and the Macedonians start. Well, no, there's 2. There's three segments to the turn, and one of them is dependent on the type of turn chosen. So the Macedonians play a planning phase, as do the Tyrians, where they get some points to allocate, etc., and then they're going to decide what kind of turn they're taking at that point. And they have either the choice of a naval superiority and bombardment phase, where you're shifting boats and trying to undermine the walls using a combination of rams and catapults on board ships and stuff like that. Or you choose to do an amphibious assault. Now, you're only allowed to amphibious assault once in the course of the game. If you fail at it, you lose as the Macedonians. That's a Tyrian victory. Now, obviously, without any boats, I'm not going to succeed in that. So I'll be picking the naval superiority and bombardment. Those aren't going to be too effective without boats either, though. So, well, we got to get boats in, obviously. And boats come in through this. And we'll see how that happens as we hit the rolls. But the goal of the game is during an amphibious assault to hold both the Temple of Hercules and the Agonorium within the city. Obviously, in order to do that, you have to breach the walls. All right. The way this is going to work is you play out each game turn. You do the planning. If you're doing naval superiority, you'll be playing it out in 10 impulses here, and you'll engage in some naval combat as well as some of the actual siege activities that take place. On the other hand, when you do the assault, you're going to have 16 turns to do it, but you have some limitations. I think it's 10 or 12 turns that you have to make one of these yours. You have to get within the walls within a certain amount of time, or it just gets called off. And if you meet all the requirements, well, then still by turn 16 you have to hold both of these. If you manage to do it before that, you win. All right. Let's look at what the different pieces are and the roles that go with this. First of all, you have a bunch of different kind of pieces in this game. And this game's rules are somewhat of a mess. My impression of this is that the game was broken. I remember not only are the rules a pain in the ass and maybe ambiguous in some places, and yes, there's 2 sheets of errata here, which hopefully I've got integrated into my rule set. But also, on top of them being a pain in the ass, there were real mechanical problems with the game in terms of maneuvering the boats and getting them to work right. And you've got this kind of alternating who goes first in a phase. I just remember this being a real headache. I've rated it very poorly. It may be a playable game under it. It may be a matter of once you've played it enough times, because I've heard some people say they really liked this one. Once you've played it enough times, you kind of get over the hurdle of the rules and the ambiguities, and it's all hammered out and how to deal with the ships. But as it stands right now, it's painful. And, well, if you don't want to deal with me stumbling through painful rules, go on to one of the other Art of Siege games once I cover them, because this one to me is the loser in the bunch. It's a shame. This is a Mark Herman game, one of his first 2, I think. This and Stonewall. Stonewall is almost entirely derivative from Terrible Swift Sword, which I've got somewhere. There it is, in another big soapbox. Stonewall is almost entirely derivative of that, with some significant changes that kind of broke the design in my view. And some of them were used, some in later GB, Great Battles of the American Civil War. Some later ones, some of them were withdrawn as just being kind of too painful. And I think eventually most of those just kind of faded out of use in the later incarnations, but I'm not positive about that. This one shows a great deal of, the desire and interest in the subject that obviously sparked the Great Battles of History series over here, starting off with Alexander. I've actually got the original over here. I don't know why. I gotta get rid of that thing. Not that it's ugly. The components are ugly. It's a cool game still. But the advanced version, the deluxe version, supersedes it, and I bought that for that reason. Anyway, you clearly get the feeling of, someone who's really, really interested in this subject matter and really is reaching hard to do something impressive here. Unfortunately, the constraints of a 16-page rule book, the fact that there probably wasn't enough time put into development, and the obvious situation of somebody kind of new designing translates to something that I think is at least troublesome to understand the rules. Let's start going. And it's a pity because I don't think anything else covers this that I'm aware of. It's really an ambitious battle to undertake. Maybe Alexander has a module for it or something, but it wouldn't really be much of a land battle. It would fit more under like a war galley scenario or something. It would fit. There's another Great Battles of History, Caesar and Alexandria, that combines the war galley and the Great Battles of History. And something like that for Tyre would actually make a lot of sense because there are a lot of naval battles. It would really be a neat situation to see done again. Because I don't think this one quite works well enough. Anyway, you can tell I don't want to touch the rules, right? Let's look at what we have. First of all, we have different kind of leaders. We have land leaders who have 4 ratings: combat bonus, morale rating. These both affect combat. Command radius affects movement in combat, and a movement allowance, obviously. And then we have naval leaders who have a ramming rating, which affects their ability to steer their ship, essentially, a melee bonus, and a command radius. Each ship, and ships are distinguished with stripes to indicate the type of ship they are. I don't know if that has much effect on play. I don't remember it having much. But they come with a melee strength, a movement allowance, and then a special ramming movement allowance. Maybe it affects the ram table. I haven't really looked too much at the difference. Yes, it does, because it affects the type of ship. Now, is that explained here? I think the number of stripes is the issue. Yeah, here we have it. So we don't have the stripes actually written on here. Triremes are the 5-7-10s, which have 2 stripes. Biremes are the 4-8-11s, which have no stripes. They're the smallest ones. And then we have quinqueremes, which are heavier ships, but slower. And they've got the single stripe. And this may indicate the number of decks or something. Anyway, we'll have to kind of pay attention to those as we actually fight the Navy, because there's a lot of a lot of tactical influence of what you're hitting with what in this. For your actual units, you have a melee strength and a movement allowance, as well as a type. You also have units with parenthesized melee strength. Anything that's disorganized, which is an effect in combat, is going to get that, or disrupted. But also archers are going to have no melee strength. And I don't know if you can see, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. I know my eyes are going bad. All right. I also have a bunch, and I do this, I clip these off the counter trees. And it's pretty helpful in this game. In some games, it's pretty useless. You got a bunch of different counters that are informational. These disrupted counters. Let's get out of the light. And then on the other side of them, you have an exhausted. Those are for the naval units. You have wall breach markers. These kind of things are going to be used in Acre as well, and Constantinople. Pin markers, which indicate that you've slammed into a boat, but it may also have other effects. And then you got these kind of weird battering ram, and on the other side, catapults. And these are the naval tools that Alexander has for trying to take down the wall. He mounts these on boats and tries to hit the wall with them. It seems to me that they're purely limited by countermix, to the extent that if you build one, you can't, and it gets destroyed, it goes in the bag, it's gone. Alright. Let's maybe try not to go into the rules in too much detail, because I mean, I've read them again and I'm still not really with a good grasp. Maybe looking at the board or the charts will help more. So the first thing you do in a turn is the Macedonian writes down if he's bombarding or assaulting. The Tyrian player allocates his engineering points. He's going to get 6 of these that he has to divide between wall repair, ship repair, and mining coastal hexes with boulders. Coastal hexes are these beaches here. He can make it harder to land on those beaches. There's 2 types of wall in the game. There's primary walls, and then there's secondary walls, these kind of greenish things. The secondaries, none of them are right on the waterfront, and most of them are facing, further from where the mole is. Which one's easier to hit? We'll have to see when we start looking at the breaches. So it's easier to knock down secondary walls, but the problem with secondary walls is you have to deal with these beaches, and the beaches have a problem with landing on them, and especially a problem if the Tyrians are throwing boulders on them. In particular, this side of the water is very difficult, or of the island is very difficult to land on, I believe. I may have that opposite. This may be the hard side. We'll see. Okay. Then the Macedonian is going to get to construct more mole hexes, and that's kind of just this random occurrence that moves them forward as you go. Let's see if we've got a chart somewhere. Nah, it's in the rules somewhere, I guess. He can also spend points on his catapults and battering rams. He's not allowed to repair his ships, though. And that's kind of important. Then the engineering points that the Tyrian player has are used for repairing ships, mining the coastal hexes, and repairing the damaged wall hexes using the wall repair table. Somewhere or another there's a wall repair table. Here it is. So however much it's damaged, each point you get gets you a die roll on here, I guess, and that indicates how many of those points you're able to repair. And the more damaged the wall is, the harder it's going to be to fix. So once breaches start happening, it's much, much more difficult for Tyre to keep up with their repairs. All right. Then it's strategic movement, and the Macedonian player can basically shift his battering rams and catapults to ships, or his land combat units, and this is why I don't have to place them on the board for the Macedonians at all. And he loads them onto ships, or he can just move them along the mole. If somehow the mole gets all the way to here, now that's very unlikely, but if it gets to there, it's pretty much over at that point, because yeah, I don't know why it's over. You still got to take the wall down. All right. Because you can't climb up those walls easily. And there isn't, this provides protection, but I don't think it provides an assault platform, even if you make the mole get there. Okay. Then you go to the naval reinforcement phase, and you'll be rolling on each of these fleets to see if it comes in. The RSL fleet, whatever that is, Rhodes, Salimalis, Lycia, comes in automatically, but these others may come in earlier. And you really do want to get a significant amount of your fleet, because you don't want to be sending out some small portion of what you're going to eventually have and facing the entire Tyrian fleet. You'll get your ass kicked. So a lot of this comes down to kind of the luck of the strategic roles, both the navies coming in, success with your bombardment, etc. But there is significant influence on the tactical actions of the boats, even within that, if you let the Macedonians get ahead. All right. So then you hit a choice between whether you're going to do a naval superiority and bombardment or an amphibious assault. And the naval superiority and bombardment works kind of weird. On odd turns, the Tyrian player moves first on the odd impulses within this, and this is spelled out on here. And on even ones, the Macedonian moves first. And basically, the first player moves, then the second player moves. Rams are done in this, and rams can cause pins, forcing the enemy to not be able to move during their turn. Then there's going to be a melee, which is simultaneous, and that kind of, there's something very wanky about how that works. Then the Macedonian's allowed to try to bombard, or if he's essentially ramming a primary wall with a ship, he's able to roll on the shipboard battering ram table. So he's got two tables he can use, either the catapult or battering ram. If he's attacking secondary walls, he gets to add one to the die roll. You can't ram secondary walls because there aren't any next to the water, and that's actually pointed out in the rolls. But the chart, well, maybe it works for Constantinople. You get the feeling there was some collaboration between the design for Tyre, Acre, and Constantinople. I think Phil Kosnick did Acre. He did one of the series, and somehow it makes me think that he did that. Another name. He's a big play tester for the SFB stuff. Eventually. Okay. Then, after you play out the number of, let's see, this is repeated 6 times, so we do 6 sets of, so Tyre moves first, then the Macedonians move first. Yeah, so this is each turn here. So Tyre moves, Macedonian moves, then you take the rest of the actions, then Macedonia moves, then Tyre moves, then you take the rest of the actions, etc. That goes 6 times through there. At the end of that, you're able to send your ships back to little port hexes. Stacking is 1 per hex for almost everything. You're allowed a boat, a military unit, and a siege engine or something like that, pretty much in every hex. And a leader. You may have more than 1 leader, I don't remember. I think only 1. Anyway, at the end of the battle, you're able to go back to your ports. You're also able to regroup your ships. Now, the Tyrians don't want to do this. Basically, you take 2 damaged ships and turn them into a whole one, because the Tyrians can use some of their engineering points to repair ships. So they've got a disadvantage in doing that. The Macedonians really probably do want to do it because half-strength ships are much weaker. Alright, for amphibious assault, here the Macedonian player chooses to load troops on board ships instead of other stuff. And he's going to follow a pulsing where first Alright, and this goes the same way in terms of ordering. First the Tyrian goes first, then the Macedonian, and then in the next one the Macedonian goes first, then the Tyrian. Same kind of action with the naval movement, but there are a lot more activities here. Of course, you have a limited amount of time to get through them. So first player moves, second player moves. Ramming can happen during this. There's simultaneous naval melee. The Tyrians are allowed to use their catapults to shoot at the naval units. They were able to do this back in the other one too. I don't know if I caught that. And they can also shoot at land units, say along the mole or on the ground, if they can trace a line of supply, but they can only shoot at one thing. Then the Macedonians get to do land movement. Tyrians get to do land movement. This does not pulse back and forth. Both sides do a simultaneous fire combat, which also had some problematic issues when I was trying to resolve it. The rules aren't terribly sensible about this. They try to give examples, but it really looks like kind of something where you've got to get used to it for it to start working smoothly at all. Maybe. I don't know. I remember this and the naval movement really causing nothing but headaches for me. Then each player has a melee segment where they announce attacks, and they'll be rolling on some kind of table here. There's the naval melee. We got the land melee over here. And it's what a standard odds ratio, but there are modifiers for all kinds of stuff, including army morale. Army morale changes based on the effects within the game, and that can become a die roll modifier and all this, as are leaders and all kind of other stuff. Then you're able to undisrupt your own units. Both players do so. Now, in the 10th impulse, the Macedonians have to have the Temple of Hercules or the Agendrium, and after the 16th, they have to have both. Otherwise, the Tyrians win. You got one shot to do an assault. You have 12 turns to build your way up to it. You'll probably not be making the assault until the 12th turn, because you want to weaken the city as much as possible. There's no reason when you only have one shot at it, unless something neat happens where you think you've got a special advantage because the Tyrian player screwed up his deployment. There's no really good reason why you'll not do this on the last turn of the game. Okay. For naval movement and facing, okay, so they go into all this effort to show that you face a hex side, putting every single picture with boats in it, having illegally faced units, even in some cases where I believe the illegally faced unit can be meleeed or something. I don't know. No, this one's illegally faced, so it may not melee. You know, what? A lot of effort put into that, but basically, you can move up to your movement allowance. If you want to ram, you have to start 3 hexes away from the enemy. The last 2 hexes of movement, you're not allowed to turn, and you're only allowed 1 turn during the entire ram movement. You also end up using your ram movement speed. So like I said, at least 3 hexes from the enemy, and you've got this big speed to hit them with. If you do hit them, you roll on some kind of ram table or something. Yeah, you can see how much I like this. I don't like looking through lots of tables particularly. Alright, that ain't it. Yeah, I don't know how you do that. Let's see. Ramming. You have to hit them in the broadside. You look at the ramming table, 6.4. Oh, here it is. And you compare the defending ship to the attacking ship, and you get a die roll. On a star, it's a chance of pinning, or damaging or sinking. A P is pinned. That doesn't... Oh, yeah, that does show here. Numbers indicate the range. Okay, so you roll a die to see if you get the result, either pinned or a possible damage or sunk. And you add 1 to the die roll if the defending ship is damaged or transporting, and you add 2 if it's doing both. Basically, it looks to me like an attacking trireme is going to be your best bet. The quinquireme's the secondary, the bireme's the tertiary. And there's no real advantage to the quinquireme, which is, well, it'll have a high melee rating. So let's keep going. Alright. Naval melee happens simultaneously. The friendly naval unit must be parallel and adjacent to, or pinned to, an enemy unit. If the ships aren't set up that way, in one of those conditions, you can't attack. It's voluntary. Now remember, this is simultaneous. You add the melee strength of all attacking ships, subtract the melee strength of the one defending unit, and any leader gets added in. You roll a die on the differential table for melee. And your results are a disruption, which gives you one of these counters. Damage, where you flip it, or sunk. Now, you can't capture them. Whenever you ram and use ram speed, you get an exhausted marker, which means next turn you're going to be going half speed. You won't be able to go ram speed at all, so you can't ram on that turn. You've got to recover that. Alright. Now, at some point or another in this complicated movement sequence, you're allowed to bombard. And the Macedonian is allowed to bombard. He allocates all the fire of his ship-built borne catapults at a particular wall hexes. And after he's allocated them all, then he gets to fire, and that's a pretty simple chart, this catapult bombardment table here. I believe this is also the time when you resolve any ships that have charged right into a wall, and they also get to try to damage that wall. I don't know what the effect of the boom is. You can take that apart too. Alright. Bombardment is 4 hex range, and you don't have to trace line of sight. You need to get 6 breach points off these little things in order to fully take a wall down. And then it can still be repaired. It's a breached wall. During counter bombardment, the Tyrian player allocates fire from his catapults against Macedonian naval units. And after he allocates, he rolls dice. And there's got to be a chart for that too. There's the counter bombardment table. And you can do that either at... now you do it at a ship, but you're also taking out the catapult or battering ram. You don't aim at just one, you aim at both at once. During wall repair, the Tyrian player can use his engineering points, which he allocated, to repair wall damage. And here he determines how many points to allocate to each wall, and then he rolls the dice for that. And that's pretty simple. We talked about the wall repair table. Really, this is a matter of learning all the tables to a large extent. Although the movement, the integration of movement in combat, I remember being really sticky and ugly. But maybe things have gotten better for me. During naval superiority and bombardment, you're using Macedonian allied ships to carry the battering rams and catapults. During amphibious assault, you use them for transporting land units. And you can also bring land leaders with you. You don't carry the other stuff with you. If you're transporting anything, you may not ram enemy units, and as we noted, you have a disadvantage on the ram table when you're hit. You can transport either a catapult or a battering ram, or a land unit, depending on the phase. Alexander and King Azamilk are dual leaders, and they have ratings for both naval combat and for land combat, depending on which side you want to put them on. I believe you have to pick which side they're going to be. So if you're doing a naval, if you're doing naval bombardment, that's not a big deal. They'll be on the naval side. But if you're doing an invasion, you have to choose which side they're going to be for the entirety of that invasion. Alexander may be forced to be a land commander. Okay. You're able to carry 2 land combat units, plus a leader on each full-strength ship during an amphibious assault. If you're a damaged ship, you can only carry 1. These troops on board the ships can't melee. However, the fire combat units can engage in fire combat with Tyrian land units and can be fired upon. The Macedonian melee units are going to be all under deck. The Macedonian naval units have to be adjacent to a beach hex, which is adjacent to a secondary wall, or a breached primary wall hex, and they can disembark onto either the beach, in which case the naval unit moves adjacent to the beach hex, and the Macedonian player announces the ship's disembarking. He rolls a die. If the ship... Okay, we gotta see what that die roll means, but he rolls a die against this number, but I don't remember whether you want low or high. So we can look for if there are rules on that. I mean, there are, but if we can find them. Okay. If you roll equal or less than the number listed in the hex, the ship's destroyed. And remember, the Tyrian player can drop rocks in these areas, so that would go from a 1 to a 3, making it harder to beach onto. He's got to spend a lot of effort to put rocks all along all his ones, though. He's got a lot of them. But the other side of the island is pretty well defended. You can see these numbers. Fuck. Well, you can't see these numbers, but if I come in there, you can maybe. All right. So the tricky part of movement, first of all, some of it is what can you move through? You got a terrain effects chart somewhere, which is pretty standard, right? With a movement point allowance. But what gets tricky here is the walls. You can't enter an enemy-controlled secondary wall from a non-wall hex. That's got to be a primary wall. And this is the secondary wall, or something. These look like the same thing. Let's see if the rolls tell me anything that I can find while I'm trying to read through them. Yeah, I'm trying to remember if you can stack in this shit or not. Okay, you can never stack with enemy units. You can move through enemy leader or siege units, which destroys them. You can move through friendly units, but you can't stack at the end of the movement. Once you move a unit into an enemy zone of control, you can't go any further, and you can't move directly from one zone of control to another. Let's see about these walls. So most of the movement is normal, but breached walls are going to cost you 2 movement points to move through. To move from a wall hex to an adjacent unbreached wall is only half a movement point. You're walking along a road, basically, there. The cost to move from a non-wall to an unbreached secondary wall is 4. However, you cannot move into an enemy-controlled unbreached secondary wall unless you move there from an adjacent wall hex. That could include an adjacent breached wall hex, though. So if there's a breach here, a level 6 breach, you can climb up the wall that way. But that's what that's why we've got this P here, enemy-controlled secondary wall versus non-enemy controlled secondary wall. And there's somewhere in the errata it says Tyrian units only pay 1 to move back up onto the walls. Basically, what's happening there is they've got ladders and staircases going up the walls from the inside. primary walls, you can, I think, never move on to them. There's cliffs 150 feet in some places. The secondary walls are somewhat smaller, so you can climb them if they're not defended. So the primary walls are just essentially unclimbable except from an adjacent wall hex. However, again, you can climb up a breach, I guess. That's not clear here. And again, the Tyrians have that one movement point advantage there. Maybe you're not supposed to be able to climb up a breach. Okay, we did the beaches. The booms! Okay. These are massive wooden logs and ships chained together. The Macedonians can destroy booms if they stay with a full-strength naval unit adjacent to them for a complete impulse, at which point we got to mark the boom as being wrecked at 1 hex of it. Now, their effect as naval units defending behind them are going to be doubled in strength. I don't know if you can ram through a boom. That would be kind of weird. I would guess not. The city proper has its own special rules where the city markers are. That's going to have somewhat higher expenses to movement. That's all. And we got some slopes too, which have an effect on both movement and combat. Every combat unit, including missile units, exerts a zone of control, including disrupted units. They're going to have a few effects. They stop units from moving. They interfere with the range for command. However, you can trace through command through your own units. Fire combat. My arm's killing me here. That's got a chart, I think, on the back of the rules. Okay, this is a range versus weapon type, which gets you a column on the fire combat table that you're going to get. And the effects are disruptions, retreats, and eliminated. Fire combat's simultaneous. You have to trace a line of sight for fire combat against regular units. Catapults, remember, can shoot at boats and at walls without tracing a line of sight. But the Tyrian catapults can shoot at boats. But because it's simultaneous, both players take their results at once. There are going to be places where the retreats end up not being able to be completed and they end up as eliminations because of that. I don't want to go into all the details of it. I don't think it helps much. Melee combat is going to be not simultaneous, if I recall correctly. Let me see if I can read this. Yeah, both players have their own melee combat. It's optional, but there's times when you can retreat before melee. A lot of detail on something that is kind of towards the end of the game and not only done, in the one during the assault period. Looking to see if there's a retreat before combat rule here that I can see. I'm having trouble finding it. I got the base. Some units have the option. Well, we'll see if we have those units. They're probably the missile units, but I don't see any rules on it. The base procedure is you total the melee strengths of the units attacking. You add the leader bonus if it's applicable. The leader bonus is going to be if a leader is stacked with a unit, he adds his combat bonus, which is the first number on the left there. There are other numbers here that are important. In particular, we're going to be touching the morale rating and the command radius. And I got to plug myself in, which is going to further hurt my arm. Yeah, I don't believe in editing. It's a pain in the ass. You can skip over this crap, right? It's like 20 people are going to watch this, right? A couple hundred maybe, but anyway. It significantly increases the processing time to put the movies together with the high definition. Although this is probably going to end up in 2 pieces just because it's so long anyhow. All right, automatically. So, where are we here? So you compare the attack strength to the defense strength. This is going to be done as a ratio, rounded in favor of the defender. The morale rating of a leader can be added to the die roll or subtracted by the defender under the one circumstance that all the units can be commanded by that leader. They're in his contingent. They also have to all, at least one of them has to be within his command radius. And you get a number of results, which are disruption, retreat, and elimination. Let's see if we have the melee results table. There it is. Nothing too exciting there. It's possible for multiple leaders to add their strength to a combat, but they can only do so. If they do so, there's not going to be a morale bonus in that combat for them, because there will be multiple contingents. That's what they say. I believe it because, like, Alexander can command stuff that other people can command. So I don't know. Disrupted units can't attack. You can't attack through an unbreached primary wall unless the friendly unit is an adjacent wall hex. So you can attack from wall to wall. And again, I assume breached walls you can attack from, but I don't know. Maybe breached walls are just breach hexes. We have, yeah, I think they are, because you have specific breach hexes. So I don't think you can climb the breach to the wall. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you could, so. I mean, I've got this picture of, you know, a crumbled down piece of a wall coming down like this, and guys climbing up that crumbled down piece. But I think that's maybe a few could, but you couldn't send a unit up that way. Okay. Let's see what we got here. Okay. So now army morale. Let's talk about this a little bit. The first time the Macedonians enter Tyre, enter the city of Tyre. Yeah, it had first the walls, but they changed it to the city in the thing. The Macedonian morale goes up by 1 for their entire army. Okay. If 6 Macedonian units are eliminated, Macedonian army morale goes down by 1. These start at 0. If King Azamilk is killed, the army morale for Tyre goes down by 1. If the temple or the Agonorium hexes are entered by Macedonians, Tyrian morale goes down by 1. This is going to affect, I believe, the die roll. Yeah, these are modifiers on the die roll. So initially you don't have any, but army morale counts just like leader morale does in that. Now I'm looking for the effect of leader strength. I'll worry about it later. It's not worth this. Okay, so if you eliminate a defending unit, you can move forward and advance into their space, disregarding enemy zones of control. There's a path of retreat after a unit retreats. Attacking units can advance along it, ignoring zones of control, but they can only go through hexes that were retreated through, i.e. you can get several hexes of movement there. What about siege engines? We've got these siege towers. They provide some protection. They have their own movement, they don't have melee, and they can only be destroyed by the Tyrrhenian fire ship. We have that here. That's an option which Tyre can build or just use or something. They cannot be destroyed by catapults, for example. Tyre, oh, they do help with the wall. So those siege towers, you can't put them on boats for obvious reasons. They have no melee strength. If a unit in the wall is attacked by a fire unit in a hex with a siege tower, it gets no defensive benefit. Apparently, there's a defensive benefit to the wall for fire combat or something. Add 1 if the target unit's in a breached wall or beach. It's easier to shoot them. Subtract 1 if they're in a wall hex. Subtract 2 in the temple in the 2 victory point hexes. And now I lost my page. So I'm holding this damn thing. Okay. The siege towers do not provide protection against catapults, but they aren't destroyed by them. The Macedonian catapults, we've already largely talked about them, as we have with the battering rams. The Tyrian catapults can be used both during the regular combat against units during fire phase using line of sight, but also they can be used against the boats in the bombardment phase or in the landing period. They can't be used in both on the same impulse, though. All right, the mall. This was not historically completed during the siege and then got abandoned, and the sea took care of the rest of it. During the construction segment, the Macedonian player rolls a die. On a 4 through 6, the mole is going to be extended 1 hex. First the northern hex. God damn it. Then the next time it succeeds the southern hex, then the northern hex. As you can see, it's going to take quite a few turns to reach there. Now, I've got 12 turns to the game. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It takes about 7 turns, but it's a 50-50 chance. So chances are I'm going to get the mole within range where I can start firing at the enemy. And I'll probably want to have my siege tower on it to give me some additional defensive and offensive capabilities. And if I get real lucky, I'll make it there by the end of the game. Catapults and rams. The Macedonians has 4 of these at the beginning of the game. You can build 1 during each Macedonian construction segment. Once built, they cannot be changed, and if they're destroyed, that particular catapult or battering ram may not be rebuilt. I'm guessing the counter is removed from the game. The Tyrian points. Tyre gets to spend 2 points to drop boulders into a hex. That'll add 2 to the beach number. He can't spend more than 4 of his 6 points per turn on this. Damaged Tyrian ships can be repaired for 2 engineering points each. And then the other engineering points can be put for wall repair. And remember, after the bombardment's done, you allocate them to the hexes you want to and roll the dice for those. There's a Tyrian fire ship that we talked about. Once per game, the Tyrian player can launch it from one of the 2 harbors. It's considered a trireme for movement. It cannot be rammed or melee attacked. It cannot initiate melee. If it successfully rams a Macedonian naval unit or comes adjacent to one of the siege towers, or both of them, if these are up on the mole, good reason not to just put them out there early in the game, right? If it comes adjacent to one or both of them, it destroys them. This means you may want to, if you see that fire ship come out, try to build a protective barrier with your fleets to prevent the Tyrians from destroying your siege towers. You only get 2 of those, and those are your way into the wall without breaching the walls. It'll be automatically eliminated, and then it's out of the game. There's the morale ratings for the leaders. Land leaders are only partially handled in the combat rolls. Okay, your land leader here's why. The melee units have to all belong to the same contingent, but that doesn't mean you can only apply 1 morale rating. But I would say that there are cases for Alexander, for example, because he can command units of different contingents, where he and another leader could both add their combat strength to a battle, and one of them can add their command rating to morale. I think the way the rules are written is just wrong there. You also have to keep your troops within radius in order to move fully. Otherwise, I think their movement is halved. We've already kind of talked about naval leaders. For deployment, the Tyrrhenian land units are on the island, and the naval units are in the ports. I don't really feel the need to do that right now, because there's nothing that can be done at this point in the game. But as things start happening, I'll start putting units on the board. We've talked about the victory conditions already, and I think that's all we have here. And this has been a long video, but it's under an hour, and I think maybe that'll fit on one vid. I hope so, because I really hate running this through Windows Movie Maker. It distorts the video, I think. As well as taking hours to process. All right, up it goes.